Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the necessary components of life in an organism and then also directional terms in anatomy. Before we go over the new lesson, though, I want you to review the information from yesterday's lesson. So take some time to review these questions. You can pause the recording while you're reviewing these questions and then press play when you're ready to move on. So for today's lesson, we're going to talk about the necessary life functions for living organisms and the directional terms for anatomy. So first, the necessary life functions for organisms. Um, Organisms need to maintain boundaries that separate the inside from the outside. For example, when you have a cell, inside the cell you have the organelles and the cytoplasm that are inside the cell, and then you have the cell membrane that separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. So that's an example of maintaining boundaries. For movement, they need to be able to have locomotion. So that's, for example, a form of locomotion is walking, and there needs to be a movement of substances within the body. There needs to be responsiveness or irritability. So the organism needs to be able to sense changes and react. So, for example, the reason it's called irritability is when a baby is born, they use something called the Apgar scale. And during the Apgar scale test, they flick the baby's foot. And if it responds by pulling the foot away, then it's a healthy baby. So, in order to be having a life function, it needs to be able to react to the environment. It needs to be able to digest food by breaking down and absorbing nutrients. And then within living organisms, they need to have metabolism, which are chemical reactions within the body. These break down complex molecules into smaller ones. So, for example, when you eat a piece of steak, there's a lot of protein in the steak, and the body breaks down the protein into smaller amino acids that your body can use. Or if you eat a piece of bread, in the bread are complex carbohydrates, which are polysaccharides, and the body breaks those polysaccharides down into simple sugars or monosaccharides so the body can more easily use it for energy. It also can build larger molecules from smaller ones. So, for example, the body can use the glucose or the monosaccharide to produce glycogen, which is stored energy in the body, or it can use the amino acids in your food to build muscle. Metabolism produces energy in the form of ATP, and it's regulated by the hormones in your body, primarily the thyroid hormones. Um, Another necessary life function is excretion. So your body needs to eliminate waste from metabolic reactions, and waste can be removed in the form of urine, feces, or sweat. Then reproduction needs to occur. It can occur on the cellular level or the organismal level. On the cellular level, new cells are used for growth and repair. So this is like mitosis. And then on the organismal level, the reproductive system handles the task. This would be meiosis, if you guys remember that from biology. For growth, the living organism needs to increase the cell size or the body size through increasing the number of cells, and hormones play a major role in this. There's a hormone called the human growth hormone, which is necessary for proper development in human beings. So think about it. What are the necessary life functions in living organisms? Summarize each one. So I want you to think about the different criteria I just went over on the previous slides that determine if an organism has necessary life functions. You can pause the recording and then press play when you're ready to move on. So survival needs, in order to survive, living organisms need certain requirements. So the first one are nutrients. These are chemicals used for energy and cell building. This includes carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals, and we get this from our diet. Oxygen is required for chemical reactions. We get this through the respiratory and cardiovascular systems. So the way your body works is you breathe in oxygen into your lungs. The oxygen is passed through the cell membrane walls of the alveoli to the capillaries that surround the alveoli, and then it's spread out into your body on red blood cells. So that's how our cells get oxygen from the atmosphere. We'll go over it more later when we cover the respiratory system. Water is necessary. It makes up 60 to 80% of your body weight, so that's why it's so important to make sure you stay hydrated. It's the most abundant chemical in the human body, and it provides the fluid base for body secretions and excretions. Essentially, if you don't get enough water, your body can't work effectively. Normal body temperature is essential for survival. On average, the normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Below this temperature, the chemical reactions in your body will slow and stop. Above this temperature, chemical reactions proceed too rapidly. So 98.6 is considered the normal, but they say that if your resting body temperature is within 1 degree of this, you're still within the normal range. And then atmospheric pressure is necessary for survival, and it needs to be appropriate for gas exchange. So the reason for this is our respiratory system relies on atmospheric pressure to breathe. Your diaphragm, when it contracts, it drops down, which increases the volume in your lungs, and that decreases the pressure in your lungs relative to the atmosphere. And so because of Boyle's law, they want to reach equilibrium between pressure inside and outside. So air rushes into your lungs. And then when your diaphragm relaxes, the pressure inside your lungs is greater than the atmospheric pressure. So you exhale to make sure that because the gases want to maintain equilibrium, so they leave the body to a place of lower pressure. So as you guys know, if you go higher up in elevation, it's harder to breathe, and that's due to the atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure is lower at higher elevations. So this diagram just shows examples of relationships between organ systems that illustrate the life functions. So the digestive system takes in nutrients, it digests them, which is part of the metabolism, and it excretes unabsorbed matter in the form of feces. The respiratory system takes in oxygen, which is required for metabolism, and it excretes carbon dioxide. The cardiovascular system, via the blood, distributes oxygen and nutrients to all body cells and delivers waste and carbon dioxide to disposal organs, such as the kidneys. The urinary system excretes nitrogen-containing waste and excess ions, and then nutrients and waste pass between blood and cells via the interstitial fluid. And finally, the integumentary system protects the body as a whole from the external environment in the form of our skin. So we're going to review the information we just covered on the last few slides. Think about what are the survival needs for living organisms. Briefly summarize it in your own words, and then you can pause this recording while you think about this question, and then press play when you're ready to move on. So now we're going to talk about the language of anatomy. We're only going to cover a portion of this section today, and then tomorrow we're going to continue moving on with the language of anatomy. So special terminology is used to prevent misunderstanding. They use the same terminology in every country, and it's in Latin, so that way there aren't any language barriers between countries. Exact terms are used for position, direction, regions, and structures in the body. Today we're going to talk about directional terms. So anatomical position is the standard body position used in the medical field to avoid confusion. Terminology refers to this position regardless of the actual body position of the patient. So for example, If the patient is lying on their side, you'll still use anatomical position to describe body parts. Anatomical position, the person's standing erect, their feet are parallel, the arms are hanging at the sides, and their palms are facing forward with their thumbs pointing away from the body. Here's a picture of anatomical position. So as you can see, the person's standing straight up, their feet are parallel, their arms are by their sides with their palms facing forward. So directional terms help explain the location of one body structure in relation to another. I'll give you a few examples today so that you can understand it better. And then after the lecture, I'm going to have you complete an assignment on Quizlet to help you learn these terms more easily. So the first directional term we're going to cover is superior, which is also known as cranial or cephalic. This means toward the head or upper part of a structure or the body, or it can also mean above. So for example, the knee is superior to the ankle because the knee is closer to the head. And then inferior is the next term. This is also known as caudal. This means away from the head or toward the lower part of a structure or the body, and it means below. So the ankle is inferior to the knee because the ankle is further away from the head. Anterior or ventral means toward or at the front of the body, in front of. So you can use this in a variety of ways. You can say that the pectoralis major is anterior to the rhomboid major. So the pectoralis major is a pec muscle. The rhomboid major is a muscle on your back. So the pec muscle is in front of the back muscle. And then posterior or dorsal, it means toward or at the backside of the body or behind. So another example of this is the scapula is posterior to the clavicle. So the scapula is the shoulder blade, the clavicle is the collarbone. So the shoulder blade is further back, so it's posterior to the clavicle. So here's a chart explaining what I just said. Another example is the forehead is superior to the nose for superior. Another example for inferior is the navel is inferior to the breastbone. Another example of anterior is the breastbone is anterior to the spine. And another example for posterior is the heart is posterior to the breastbone. Medial means toward or at the midline of the body or on the inner side of. So for example, there's a ligament on your knee, and it's on the inside of your knee called the medial collateral ligament, or MCL, and it's on the inner side of the knee, so that's why it's the medial ligament. And then lateral means away from the midline of the body on the outer side, so you also have the LCL, which is the lateral collateral ligament, and it's on the outer side of the knee, so that's why it's the lateral ligament. Intermediate means between a more medial and a more lateral structure. So the patella or kneecap is intermediate to the MCL and LCL. Proximal means closer to the origin of the body part or point of attachment to a limb to the body trunk. So proximal is similar to superior, meaning it's further up, but you only use that term when you're talking about a limb, such as an arm or a leg. So an example of proximal is the elbow is proximal to the wrist because the elbow is closer to the trunk than the wrist. And then distal means further from the origin of a body part or the point of attachment of a limb to the body trunk. So the wrist is distal to the elbow because the wrist is further away from the trunk than the elbow. And then this goes over the terms we were just covering with pictures and more examples. So another example of medial is the heart is medial to the arm because it's closer to the midline of the body. The arms are lateral to the chest because their arms are further away from the midline of the body. The collarbone is intermediate between the breastbone and the shoulder. The elbow is proximal to the wrist, which is the example I gave you. And then the knee is distal to the thigh because the knee is further away from the trunk than the thigh. The next terms are superficial and deep. Superficial means toward or at the body surface. So the epidermis is superficial to the dermis because the epidermis is closer to the body surface than the dermis. And then the deep means away from the body surface or more internal. So that would be the heart is deep to the pectoralis major because the heart is more internal than the pec muscle. So this one shows more examples. The skin is superficial to the skeleton because it's closer to the surface of the body. And then the lungs are deep to the rib cage because they're further away from the surface of the body. So we're finished with today's lecture. You have 2 questions to answer on Google Classroom. They were the think about it questions that I had you do earlier in this lecture. But then I also want you to do a Quizlet assignment in order to memorize these directional terms better. And tomorrow I'll have you do a hands-on activity or a more interactive activity to demonstrate understanding of these directional terms. And tomorrow we're going to continue going over the language of anatomy. We'll be covering regional terms, we'll cover the body cavities, and other terminology that you need to know for anatomy.